41 seconds. That's what the countdown clock on the collision advisory display read when Nora Castellan's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. Give me the controls. For words. No panic in them. Just certainty. Captain Owen Brandt's hands were locked on the yoke, knuckles white, sweat sliding down his temple as the traffic collision avoidance system blared its second warning. Outside the windscreen of the Bombardier CRJ 700, a Gulfstream G450 was closing fast at their 11 o'clock, silent on the radio, invisible to ATC's radar picture because its transponder had failed somewhere over the Sawtooth Ridgeline 40 minutes earlier. Two aircraft, same altitude, same airspace, converging like something out of a nightmare nobody had trained for on a routine maintenance test flight. Nora wasn't supposed to be flying. She was the mechanic. She'd signed off the logbook an hour ago, climbed aboard only to observe the post-repair check flight like she'd done 100 times before. Coveralls still zipped to her collar, grease still under her nails. But something in the way she said those 4 words made Owen let go. If you've ever wondered what happens in the space between a warning and a decision, stay with this one to the end, because 30,000 feet above Cedarwood Valley, a woman everyone thought they knew was about to become someone else entirely. And if stories like this one keep you holding your breath until the very last part, you already know why you're still here. Hit subscribe because this channel exists for exactly this feeling. The clock read 38 seconds. Nora's hands found the yoke like they'd never left it. Her name was Nora Castellan, 44 years old, and for the last 6 years she'd been nothing more than a name on a hangar roster at Cedarwood Regional Airlines. A&P certified, quiet, punctual, the kind of employee nobody asked questions about because she never gave anyone a reason to. What the roster didn't say was that Nora had once been Major Nora Castellan, United States Air Force, 2 combat deployments flying the F-15C Eagle out of Blackridge Air Force Base, call sign Wraith. It didn't say she'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for a night intercept mission that classified records still wouldn't fully release. It didn't say that the reason she'd left the cockpit wasn't age or injury, but grief. A wingman named Des Okafor who hadn't come home from a training exercise gone wrong, and a version of herself she wasn't sure she wanted to be anymore. So she traded a flight suit for coveralls, traded formation briefings for torque wrenches and hydraulic lines. She told people she liked the quiet of the hangar floor, and mostly that was true. Nobody at Cedarwood knew her rank. Nobody knew her call sign. She liked it that way, until the day she climbed aboard tail number N774CX simply to verify a repair, and the sky decided otherwise. Captain Owen Brandt, 31, 2 years into flying for the regional carrier, had no idea the woman in the jump seat behind him had once flown intercepts at Mach 1.8. To him, she was just Nora for maintenance, the one who always double-checked her own work twice. He was about to learn there was a third thing she always double-checked, the sky itself. The test flight had been routine on paper. N774CX had come out of a scheduled inspection with a new hydraulic pump on the number 2 system, and regulations required a functional check flight before it could return to passenger service. Owen was flying left seat. First Officer Priya Malhotra, 26, and sharp as a tack, sat right seat running the checklist. Nora rode the jump seat behind them, arms crossed, watching gauges out of habit more than duty. Pump pressures holding steady, Priya said, tapping the display. Nice and boring. Boring's the goal, Owen said, easing the CRJ through 11,000 feet on climb out for Valeria Regional Airport. Below them, Cedarwood Valley unrolled in autumn gold, ridgelines catching the late morning sun. Nora said nothing, but her eyes had already drifted to the traffic display in the lower right of the panel. A single green diamond blinked at their 10 o'clock, 30 miles out, altitude unreadable. No data tag, no transponder code. Huh, she murmured. What? Priya glanced back. Traffic without a Mode C readout, Nora said. Probably just a glitch. Down on the ramp, air traffic controller Hale Sutton was watching the same gap in his radar picture and frowning at it, because 30 miles out, cruising at 11,000 feet with a transponder that had quietly failed somewhere over the Sawtooth Ridge, a Gulfstream G450 named N22KT was flying blind to everyone except the eyes of a woman who used to hunt aircraft for a living. Aboard the Gulfstream, pilot Mitchell Cole had no idea his transponder had died. The cockpit displays showed green across the board. Altitude, heading, fuel, all nominal. What he didn't know was that a corroded circuit board behind the avionics bay had failed silently 40 minutes earlier, taking his aircraft's identity off every radar screen in the region except the raw, primary returns that only showed as a faint blip most controllers would dismiss as weather clutter. Mitchell wasn't a professional pilot by trade. He was a private owner-operator, a construction executive who'd earned his instrument rating 5 years ago and flew his own Gulfstream on business trips to save time. Competent, careful, but not trained to catch what he couldn't see. He leveled off at 11,000 feet, exactly where In-774CX was climbing, and radioed nothing, because as far as his instruments told him, nothing was wrong. Back on In-774CX, Nora's eyes hadn't left the traffic display. Priya, query ATC on that diamond. No altitude readouts bugging me. Priya keyed the radio. Cedarwood approach, Regional 774, traffic 10 o'clock, 30 miles, no mode C. Can you confirm? Hale Sutton's reply came back half a beat too slow. 774, approach, standby. We're seeing an intermittent primary return in that area. Unconfirmed altitude, working to identify. Nora's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In 6 years of quiet hangar life, that particular stillness in her chest hadn't visited her once. It was visiting her now. Unconfirmed altitude were 2 words Nora hadn't heard in the cockpit since her last deployment, and they landed the same way now as they had then, like a held breath. Owen, request a block climb to 13,000, she said from the jump seat, voice level. Just to open some vertical separation until approach sorts that contact. Owen glanced back, surprised. Maintenance techs didn't usually make climb recommendations. You sure? Just being cautious, she said, and something in her tone made him key the radio without arguing. Cedarwood approach, 774 requesting block, climb 13,000 for traffic separation. 774, standby, working other traffic, Hale answered, static crackling under his voice. On his scope, 3 other aircraft were converging into his sector at once. A cargo turboprop inbound from the south, a flight training aircraft doing pattern work, and now this ghost contact that refused to resolve into a clean altitude readout. He was one controller doing the work that normally took 2, because his relief hadn't shown up for the shift change yet. 30 miles became 20 in under 4 minutes. Mitchell Cole adjusted his Gulfstreams, heading 2 degrees to avoid a cloud deck, unknowingly angling directly into N774CX's projected flight path. Neither cockpit could see the other yet. Only the ghost diamond on Nora's display kept blinking, closer every second, its altitude tag still stubbornly blank. Priya broke the tension first, glancing over her shoulder at Nora. You always this jumpy about traffic without a tag? Only when the tag should be there and isn't, Nora said. She'd meant it lightly, but her eyes stayed locked on the display, doing math nobody in the cockpit could see. Closure rate, projected intercept geometry, time to convergence. The same math she used to run silently in an F-15 at 40,000 feet. Owen chuckled, easing tension of his own. Next you'll tell us you used to fly fighters. Nora almost smiled. Focus on your airspeed, Captain. At 19 miles, the Ghost Diamond's altitude tag finally flickered to life for half a second, 11,000 feet, before dropping out again. Nora's stomach turned to ice. Same altitude, same rough heading. No coordination. Priya, tell approach we have a possible altitude match at 11,000 on that contact, she said sharper now. Priya related. Hale Sutton's voice came back tighter. Copy, 774, working it. Cleared to climb 13,000 expedite. Expediting, Owen said, pulling back on the yoke, engines spooling louder as the CRJ's nose lifted. But climbs take time. Seconds ticked by as the aircraft trimmed for the new attitude, altitude creeping up too slowly against a closure rate Nora could feel in her bones before the instruments confirmed it. On the traffic display, The ghost diamond turned solid amber. Then, without warning, it turned red. The CAS alert hit like a gunshot. Traffic, traffic, the automated voice barked, and every head in the cockpit snapped to the display, where the red diamond now sat almost directly ahead, closing at a combined speed north of 500 knots. Where is he? Where is he? Owen's voice cracked, eyes scanning the windscreen. The sky ahead deceptively calm, deceptively empty to the naked eye. 11 o'clock, level, for miles, Nora said, already unbuckling her jump seat harness. He's not climbing. He doesn't see you. Climb, climb, CAS commanded, and Owen obeyed instantly, hauling back on the yoke. But the geometry was already wrong. A pure vertical climb straight into an aircraft at the same altitude was exactly the kind of maneuver that could turn a near miss into something unrecoverable if the other aircraft reacted unpredictably. Nora saw it a half-second before the countdown display flipped to visible numbers. 41 seconds to closest point of approach if nothing changed. Owen, listen to me. Her hand closed over the back of his headrest. Don't fight the geometry. Give me the controls. For words. Flat. Certain. Not a request. Owen's hands froze on the yoke for exactly one heartbeat. The same heartbeat where every instinct in him screamed that mechanics didn't fly airplanes, that this made no sense, that regulations and training and everything he'd ever been taught said no. And then, without knowing why, he let go. Nora slid into the void between the seats, one knee braced against the center console, hands finding the yoke, and thrust levers with a fluency that belonged to someone who'd flown intercept for a living, not someone who tightened bolts for one. Priya, get approach on guard. Tell them we have traffic conflict. Request the Gulfstream squawk emergency. Priya's hand shook as she keyed the mic, but her voice held. Cedarwood approach, 774 traffic alert. Task resolution advisory in progress. 34 seconds. Nora eased off the aggressive climb CAS had commanded and rolled the CRJ into a shallow, controlled right bank. Not the panicked yank Owen had been about to execute, but a precise vector that opened lateral separation while still gaining altitude, the exact kind of maneuver drilled into fighter pilots taught to think in 3 dimensions instead of 1. Below and ahead, Mitchell Cole finally caught movement in his peripheral vision, a shape where no shape should be. His own oral warning system, delayed by the transponder fault, screamed a half-second late. He yanked his Gulfstream into a hard left descent on pure reflex, exactly the wrong direction if the CRJ had climbed straight up as CAS first commanded. But it hadn't, because Nora had already turned right. 26 seconds. The two aircraft, still invisible to each other's naked eyes, were now diverging instead of converging, a margin measured in hundreds of feet that had, seconds earlier, been measured in dozens. Contact. Visual, Owen shouted, pointing through the windscreen at a glint of white 11 o'clock low, the Gulfstream's belly banking away beneath them, close enough that for one suspended second it looked close enough to touch. Nora didn't flinch. She held the bank, eyes flicking between the windscreen and the vertical speed indicator, counting silently the way she'd been trained to count a lifetime ago. Not with fear, but with the cold clarity of someone who had done this exact kind of math while people were shooting at her. 14 seconds. The Gulfstream passed beneath and behind them, closer than any regulation would ever call comfortable, close enough that Priya let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. Then it was gone. A shrinking white shape falling away toward the valley floor, its wake turbulence rocking the CRJ once, hard, before the sky went quiet again. Cedarwood approach, 774, traffic clear, resuming assigned altitude. Nora said into her headset, voice as even as if she were reading a grocery list. On the ground, Hale Sutton exhaled for what felt like the first time in a full minute, watching 2 blips separate cleanly on his scope after having been, for 11 agonizing seconds, a single overlapping return. 774, copy, radar contact confirmed separation. Nice work up there. He had no idea how right he was, or how little credit belonged to the man he thought was flying. The cockpit fell into a silence thicker than any storm. Owen sat frozen in the right seat now, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Watching the woman from maintenance level the aircraft with the unhurried precision of someone parking a car in an empty lot. "You can have it back," Nora said quietly, nodding at the yoke. Owen didn't move. "Who are you?" "Nora Castellan, ANP mechanic, Cedarwood Regional." Her voice was steady, but something in her eyes had gone somewhere far away, somewhere that had nothing to do with hydraulic pumps or torque specs. "That's not what I asked." Priya turned in her seat, still pale, still shaking slightly. "Nora, what you just did, that wasn't luck. That wasn't a checklist. That was—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence because she didn't have the vocabulary for what she just watched. Below, the Gulf Stream leveled out at 9,000 feet. Mitchell Cole's hands trembling on his own yoke as he keyed his radio for the first time in the encounter, voice shaking. "Approach, Gulfstream 22 Kilo Tango, I think we had a near miss up here. Is everyone okay?" Hale Sutton's reply carried the exhausted relief of a man who'd nearly watched two aircraft become one on his scope. 2 Kilo Tango, be advised your transponder appears to have failed. Squawk 7700 will get you vectors for a straight-in approach. Above him, in a cockpit gone quiet with disbelief, Owen asked again, "Nora, who taught you to fly like that?" Nora didn't answer right away. She reached forward, disengaged the autopilot she'd rearmed without thinking, and slid back toward the jump seat, letting Owen resume the controls with hands that were still faintly trembling. "Let's just get this bird back on the ground," she said. "We can talk on the ramp." But the ramp, it turned out, wouldn't be quiet either. Word travels fast in small aviation communities, and by the time N774CX touched down at Valeria Regional 22 minutes later, three things had already happened that Nora hadn't accounted for. First, Hale Sutton had filed a preliminary incident report that included, almost as an afterthought, a line about the check flight crew's exceptional recovery maneuver, a line that would eventually be read by people whose job was to notice exactly that kind of thing. Second, Priya Malhotra, still shaken, had quietly texted a friend in dispatch. "You will not believe what just happened. The mechanic flew the plane." Third, and this was the one Nora hadn't seen coming at all, a Cedarwood-based flight instructor named Grady Voss, taxiing his own Cessna back to the hangar after a lesson, had happened to be listening to the tower frequency the entire time. Grady wasn't just any instructor. 15 years earlier, before a training injury ended his own military career, he'd serve as ground crew at Blackridge Air Force Base, close enough to the flight line to recognize a very particular kind of stillness in a pilot's voice under pressure, the kind he hadn't heard since a squadron briefing room he'd left behind long ago. The debrief happened in a small, windowless office behind the Cedarwood Regional Maintenance hangar. Owen and Priya seated across a scarred metal table from their chief pilot, Renata Boone, who'd flown in from the regional office the moment she'd heard the words near miss and hydraulic test flight in the same sentence. "Walk me through it again," Renata said, arms crossed, reading glasses pushed up into graying hair. "You're telling me your mechanic took the controls. She saved the airplane." Owen said, flatter than he meant to sound, still rattled hours later. I froze. She didn't. Renata's eyes cut to Nora, who stood near the door in her coveralls, arms folded, saying nothing. "That's a serious regulatory problem, Ms. Castellan," Renata said carefully. "An unlicensed pilot at the controls of a passenger aircraft, even during a test flight." "I have a commercial certificate and current medical," Nora said quietly. "It's on file with HR. Nobody ever asked to see it, because nobody ever needed a mechanic to fly." Renata blinked, caught off guard. "You've never once mentioned that in 6 years." It never came up. Outside the office window, unnoticed by anyone in the room, a weathered pickup truck rolled into the maintenance lot and parked. Grady Voss climbed out slowly, adjusting his cap, staring at the hangar door with the unmistakable look of a man about to walk toward a memory he'd buried a long time ago. He didn't know Nora's name yet, but he was fairly certain he knew her voice. Grady found Nora alone by the fuel truck 20 minutes later, wiping her hands on a shop rag, doing her best impression of a woman with absolutely nothing unusual to discuss. "You flew that recovery like you'd done it 1,000 times," he said without preamble. Lucky guess, Nora said, not looking up. I heard the tower tape, Grady said. The way you called the bank angle. The cadence. I used to hear that exact cadence every morning at 0600 on a flight line in the high desert. He paused. Blackridge. Nora's hands went still on the rack. I was ground crew there, Grady said, voice softer now. Long time ago, before a bad landing on my own training flight ended that chapter for me. But I never forgot what it sounded like when a Wraith flight lead was talking a wingman through trouble. He studied her face carefully. There weren't many women flying Eagles out of Blackridge back then. Maybe 4 in the years I was there. Nora finally met his eyes, and for the first time since the incident, something in her posture cracked, just slightly. Not fear, but recognition, the particular ache of being seen by someone who remembered the person she used to be before grief rewired her whole life. You should let that go, Grady, she said quietly. That person doesn't work here anymore. Maybe, Grady said. But 41 seconds ago, on that tower tape, she absolutely did. That night, Nora sat alone in her small rented house outside Cedarwood, an old cardboard box pulled down from the closet shelf for the first time in 3 years. Inside it, a folded flight suit patch reading Wraith, a photograph of a younger version of herself standing beside an F-15C with a grinning airman named Des Okafor slinging an arm over her shoulder, and a small blue velvet case she hadn't opened since the funeral. She opened it now. Inside, the distinguished flying cross caught the lamplight, ribbons slightly faded. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Priya. Everyone at the hangar is asking questions. Dispatch already knows. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to spread like this. Nora stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. It's not your fault. Some things don't stay quiet forever. She thought about Des, about the training exercise that had gone wrong 2 years after their last deployment together, about the review board that had cleared her of fault and the guilt that had never once accepted the verdict. She thought about 6 years of hangar floors and torque wrenches, 6 years of choosing invisibility over identity, because invisibility didn't ask her to be brave anymore. 41 seconds in a cockpit that afternoon had undone all of it in a single instant. Outside, headlights swept across her window, a car she didn't recognize, slowing, then continuing past. Somewhere in Cedarwood, word of what happened aboard in 774CX was already traveling faster than she could control. By the next morning, the story had reached further than a hangar rumor mill. Renata Boone's incident report had been forwarded, as regulation required, to the regional FAA field office, and a young investigator named Priya Ostrander, no relation to First Officer Malhotra, had flagged one detail in the tower recording that made her sit up straight at her desk. A maneuver call so precise, so tactically sound, that it matched almost verbatim a training pattern taught in exactly one place in the country. Fighter Intercept School. At the same time, Mitchell Cole, still shaken from his own near collision, had spent the morning on the phone with his aircraft's avionics shop, furious and frightened in equal measure over the transponder failure that had nearly cost him his life. He'd also spent part of that morning talking to a local news reporter, unaware that the story he was describing, "Some mechanic saved us, I don't even know how," was about to take on a life of its own. At Blackridge Air Force Base, 300 miles away, a name flagged in a routine FAA database cross-check landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Reyes Abra, current commander of the fighter squadron, once known as the Wraiths. He stared at the incident summary for a long moment, then at a personnel file he hadn't pulled in over 2 years. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured to an empty office. "She's still out there." He picked up the phone. The call came into Cedarwood Regional's main line just after 10 a.m., and it took the front desk staff nearly 5 minutes to understand they were being asked to relay an urgent message from an active-duty Air Force lieutenant colonel to a maintenance technician named Nora Castellan. Nora took the call in the same windowless office where she'd been debriefed the day before, closing the door behind her. "Major Castellan," Reyes Abra said, and just hearing her old rank spoken aloud made something in Nora's chest tighten. "It's been a long time. It's just Nora now, sir. Not according to a tower recording that's currently making its way up 3 separate chains of command," Reyes said, not unkindly. "You want to tell me what happened up there yesterday? Or should I just play you the audio?" Nora closed her eyes. There was a transponder failure. A private jet nearly collided with a commercial test flight. I was in the wrong seat to do anything about it, so I did something about it anyway. You saved 41 people, Reyes said quietly. 2 crew, 39 on a flight that was supposed to be empty for the check ride, but wasn't because dispatch loaded a training class of new flight attendants onto it last minute to observe. Did you know that? Nora's breath caught. She hadn't known. She'd assumed the aircraft was empty except for the crew and herself. No, she said softly. I didn't know that. Well, Reyes said, now you do. And I think it's time you came back to Blackridge, even if just for a conversation. Nora didn't decide to tell anyone the truth that day. The truth decided for her. Renata Boone called an all-hands meeting in the hangar break room that afternoon. Not a punishment, she'd insisted, just a chance to clear the air before rumors outpaced reality. Owen and Priya sat near the front. Grady Voss, invited by Owen out of some instinct he couldn't fully explain, stood near the back. I want to address what happened yesterday, Renata began, because half of you have already heard 3 different versions, and I'd rather you heard it from the people who were actually there. Owen stood. His voice shook slightly, but he didn't stop. Nora didn't just help. She flew the recovery herself. Textbook. Better than textbook. I've flown with instructors who couldn't have done what she did in that many seconds. A murmur rippled through the room. Priya added quietly, I've never seen anyone that calm in my life. It was like she'd done it 1,000 times before. All eyes turned to Nora, standing near the doorway in her coveralls, the same one she'd worn for 6 quiet years. It was Grady who broke the silence. Because she has done it before, he said. Major Nora Castellan, formerly of the 71st Fighter Squadron, Blackridge Air Force Base. Call sign Wraith. Distinguished Flying Cross recipient. He looked at her with something between apology and reverence. I recognized her voice on the tower tape. I should have said something sooner. I am sorry, Nora. The room went utterly silent. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Renata, still processing, said the only thing that came to mind. You're a fighter pilot. Was, Nora said quietly. Past tense. For 6 years, past tense. Why didn't you ever say anything? Priya asked. Not accusing, just aching with confusion. Nora looked around the room at the faces she'd worked alongside for years without ever really letting them in. Owen, Priya, the ramp crew, the young apprentice mechanics who'd asked her 100 small questions about torque values and never once about the woman answering them. Because the last time I flew fast and dangerous for a living, I lost someone I loved like a brother, she said. A wingman named Des Okafor. Training accident, not combat, which somehow made it worse because there was no enemy to blame, just bad luck and thin margins. After that, I didn't want to be the person who flew into danger anymore. I wanted to be the person who made sure the machines were safe enough that nobody else had to. She let out a breath. I didn't hide my rank because I was ashamed of it. I hid it because I was trying to become someone who didn't need it anymore. Owen's voice was rough. Yesterday, you needed it. Yesterday needed it, Nora agreed. I didn't have a choice. Grady stepped forward from the back of the room. For what it's worth, Major, the Air Force still remembers exactly who you are. I think they'd like you to remember too. News of what had happened aboard in 774CX reached beyond Cedarwood faster than anyone anticipated. A local news affiliate picked up Mitchell Cole's shaken account of his near miss, cross-referenced it with the FAA incident filing, and within 48 hours a headline was circulating online. Mechanic's split-second maneuver averts midair disaster over Cedarwood Valley. Nobody outside the hangar yet knew her military history. But that was about to change too, because Lieutenant Colonel Reyes Abra had not been idle since their phone call. He'd requested, and received, clearance to formally invite Major Nora Castellan, retired, back to Blackridge Air Force Base. Not for a ceremony, but for something more urgent. The very same transponder failure that had nearly caused the Cedarwood collision had been flagged in the preceding month in 2 other private aircraft incidents across the region, all involving the same avionics manufacturer's faulty component batch. The Air Force's liaison office believed a pattern was forming that civilian aviation authorities hadn't yet connected. a pattern that needed someone who understood both fighter-level threat assessment and hands-on aircraft maintenance to help trace it before another near miss became something worse. Reyes needed Nora's eyes, not just her old call sign, her current expertise, married to the instincts that had never actually left her. "I know what I'm asking," he told her over the phone. "I'm asking you to be both people at once, the mechanic and the major." For the first time in 6 years, Nora didn't feel torn in two by that idea. She felt, for the first time, like maybe she didn't have to choose. Nora arrived at Blackridge Air Force Base 4 days later, standing on a flight line she hadn't set foot on in over 2 years. The wind carrying the same jet fuel and sagebrush smell she remembered from 100 mornings that felt like several lifetimes ago. Reyes Abram met her at the gate personally. "Welcome back, Major." "Consultant," Nora corrected gently. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." "Consultant, then," Reyes said, smiling faintly. For now, inside a secure briefing room, Nora reviewed the data alongside a team of avionics engineers and a young FAA investigator named Priya Ostrander, whose sharp eyes had first flagged the tactical precision in the Cedarwood Tower recording. 3 separate transponder failures, same manufacturer, same faulty circuit board batch, same failure signature, intermittent primary radar return, no altitude tag, silent until it was almost too late. "If this batch is as widespread as the serial number suggests," Nora said, tracing a finger down a maintenance log, "there could be dozens of aircraft flying blind right now without their owners knowing it. We need a fix, and we need it broadcast to every regional maintenance shop and private operator within the week," Reyes said. "Can you help write the technical bulletin? Nobody in this building understands both the failure mode and the cockpit consequences the way you do." Nora looked at the data, at the serial numbers, at the shape of a crisis still unfolding quietly in hangars across the country. "Give me a workstation," she said, "and strong coffee." Over the next 36 hours, Nora worked with an intensity the young engineers around her hadn't expected from someone whose personnel file listed aircraft maintenance technician as a current occupation. She cross-referenced failure logs, traced the faulty circuit board supply chain back to 3 manufacturing lots, and drafted a technical bulletin so precise that the FAA's regional office adopted it almost word for word within a day of receiving it. But it was the cockpit guidance she wrote alongside the technical fix that mattered most. A short, plain-language addendum explaining exactly what she'd done in those 41 seconds over Cedarwood Valley, translated into procedure any competent flight crew could follow. How to read a ghost contact with a missing altitude tag, when a break from a pure vertical task climb in favor of lateral separation. How to recognize an unresolving primary return as a possible transponder failure rather than radar clutter. "You just wrote next year's emergency training module," Priya Ostrander told her, scanning the draft with something like awe. "I just wrote down what should have been obvious," Nora said. "I got lucky that I had the reflexes to catch it in time. The next crew shouldn't need luck. They should have the procedure." Reyes Abra, reading over her shoulder, said quietly, "This is why I called you, Major. Not because of what you did in the sky, because of what you're doing right now at a desk to make sure nobody else needs to do what you did." Nora didn't answer right away. She just kept writing because 41 seconds had taught her exactly how little time people sometimes had. The bulletin went out to every FAA-certified repair station and private operator on the affected manufacturer's registry within 72 hours, flagged urgent. 2 more faulty transponders were discovered and replaced before they ever failed in flight. One aboard a corporate jet over Ohio, another aboard a flight school's training aircraft in Nevada, its instructor reading the new emergency procedure just 3 days after it landed in his inbox. Mitchell Cole, still shaken but grateful, personally funded the replacement of every affected transponder unit on aircraft registered through his same maintenance provider, calling it the least he could do after nearly costing 41 strangers their lives through no fault of his own. Back at Blackridge, Reyes Abra stood at the podium of a small conference room, addressing a handful of senior maintenance officers and engineers who'd spent the week working alongside Nora. "I've served with a lot of exceptional pilots," he said. "Major Castellan is one of the finest I've ever flown alongside. But what she did this week wasn't flying. It was something quieter and, honestly, just as important, making sure the next crisis never happens at all. Nora, seated near the back, felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for 6 long years. Not because of the praise. Because for the first time since Des Okafor's funeral, she'd let both halves of herself, the fighter pilot and the mechanic, work side by side instead of hiding one behind the other. Her phone buzzed. A text from Owen. "Hangar's not the same without you. When are you coming home?" Nora returned to Cedarwood Regional 8 days after the incident, stepping back onto the same hangar floor she'd worked for 6 years, this time to visible stares and quiet murmurs that followed her across the tarmac. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore the same coveralls she always had, grease already collecting under her nails from the first repair job she'd picked up that morning. Owen found her at the fuel truck, the same spot where Grady had confronted her a week earlier. "Heard you basically rewrote half the FAA's emergency training bulletin," he said. "I had help," Nora said, allowing herself a small smile. "You could have stayed at Blackridge. Consulting work, better pay, probably a medal ceremony they'd want to give you." "I told them no thank you on the ceremony," Nora said. "Some things don't need an audience to matter." "And the pay?" "I like it here," she said simply. "I like torque wrenches and quiet mornings and airplanes that stay exactly where they're supposed to be on ground. I just don't have to hide the rest of me anymore. That's the only thing that's changed." Priya approached with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Nora without a word, the gesture saying more than any speech could. Grady Voss, walking past with his flight bag slung over one shoulder, gave her a respectful nod. One veteran to another, finally spoken in the open instead of buried in old tower tapes and half-remembered cadences. 41 seconds had changed everything. And somehow, everything that mattered most hadn't changed at all. 3 weeks later, at a small ceremony held not at Blackridge, but at Valeria Regional Airport's modest terminal, Cedarwood Regional Airlines quietly honored Nora Castellan. Not with a medal, at her insistence, but with something she found she wanted far more, a dual title plaque for the hangar wall reading Major Nora Castellan, USAF Ret. Lead Aircraft Maintenance Technician. The 2 halves of her life finally written side by side instead of one erased for the other. Owen stood beside her at the small gathering, along with Priya, Renata Boone, and Grady Voss, who'd been formally invited to say a few words as the man who'd first recognized her voice on a tower recording. "I spent 15 years wishing I'd stayed close to the flight line," Grady told the small crowd. "Then one afternoon, a woman I didn't even know reminded me why that world mattered so much in the first place. Not because of what she did in the air, because of who she chose to be once she was back on the ground." Mitchell Cole, invited as a guest of honor of a different kind, shook Nora's hand firmly. 41 seconds, he said. "I've done the math on that 100 times since. I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful you were in that jump seat." "Wrong seat, right time," Nora said, echoing something Owen had said to her weeks earlier, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the memory of Des Okafor surfaced without the crushing weight of guilt attached to it, replaced instead by something that felt almost like peace. Cedarwood Valley settled back into its quiet autumn gold in the weeks that followed, hangar doors opening each morning to the same routines, torque checks, fuel logs, the low hum of engines being coaxed back to life one bolt at a time. Nora Castellan still walked the same tarmac she always had, coveralls zipped to her collar, grease under her nails, indistinguishable from anyone else on the ramp except to those who now knew what stillness in her voice really meant. She still didn't talk much about Blackridge or Wraith or the DFC that now sat, no longer hidden, in a small frame on her apartment windowsill beside a photograph of a grinning airman named Des Okafor. Some days, she still missed him so much it ached. But it was a different ache now. One carried alongside pride instead of guilt, alongside purpose instead of hiding. Every so often, a new hire at Cedarwood Regional would ask her, half joking, whether the rumors were true, that the quiet mechanic in Hangar 3 used to fly fighter jets. Nora would just smile, hand them a torque wrench, and say, "Focus on the job in front of you. That's what matters most, whether it's 41 seconds or 41 years." If this story reminded you that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the loudest kind of courage, tell us in the comments who in your own life has surprised you the same way. And if stories like Nora's are the reason you keep coming back to this channel, subscribe and stay close. Because somewhere out there, another quiet hero is still hiding in plain sight, waiting for their 41 seconds.